everyone, and welcome back to Crucial Tech. This is the first show of the year, and I brought back two of my favorite people to talk to. But this is what we're talking about today. There are lots of reasons why cyber attacks happen, and human error is the primary cause. In the United Kingdom, the Information Commissioner's Office reported that in 2019, 90% of data breaches were due to human error, which was up from 61% in 2017. And part of the reason for that increase is because people are working from home and have insecure situations. On the positive side, Verizon's 2019 Data Breach Investigations Report said that human error in employees was to be the source of 21% of the breaches. That's good news for personal, but it's bad news for corporations because that means 79% is physical errors within the technology itself, not human beings. So most users of digital technology have no idea how to secure those devices or to determine if they are secure. But a contributing factor, especially in the world of the Internet of Things, is that the devices themselves are not made to be secure. And neither are many of the crucial components of the devices. So even a savvy user can get hacked relatively easily. And one of the reasons that technology is inherently vulnerable is the cost of making them secure in any degree. So that's the focus of today's podcast. And we have brought two remarkable people to talk to us about the issue of budgeting for security. We have Matthew Rosenquist, a regular guest on this podcast, who is currently the CISO of Eclipse.co. Is that right? .co, Matthew?
.io.
Oh, .io. I typed that wrong. So Eclipse.io. That's a company that develops low-cost, lightweight, and on-demand encryption technology and then licenses it to partners. And Steve Hanna, who I interviewed a few months ago, is a director at the Trusted Computer Group, a standards group dedicated to making digital technology safe. So, gentlemen, welcome to Crucial Tech.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Mo.
So let's get right into it here. As I mentioned, we've got a real human error problem here. And the fact that most people say they can't afford to do proper security. And Steve, at a talk you gave earlier this year, you made the point that there are lots of progress being made towards standards. But the problem is that those standards are being adopted by big corporations, not by smaller corporations, because they're just financially aren't available to them. So what are we doing in the technology world to make this stuff affordable?
Well, one of the things that we're doing is to try to make those standards more accessible, easier to use and easier to adopt. So in Trusted Computing Group, we have developed a standard called the Trusted Platform Module, which is a security chip that can be included in products and is included in all Windows PCs today. And that's a requirement from Microsoft. And the thing about it is, including the chip alone is not enough to make a device secure.
Right.
You have to use that chip. And in order to use that chip, you have to integrate it with the software, so that what we're doing in Trusted Computing Group now is to focus not so much on adding more features to the chip, but on making that standard chip easier to use, easier to integrate by building support for it into things like OpenSSL libraries, into open source software like Linux. It's already built into Windows, but if you want to get it down to the IoT level, it needs to be built into the operating systems that are used in IoT. And then, it just happens. You start up the system, and when it wants to authenticate, it's going to use that chip to authenticate. You don't have to worry about whether the private key has been stolen or whether a password is adequately secure. The great thing about IoT is it is capable of doing strong authentication out of the box if properly designed. And this chip gives it that ability. So we want to make it as easy to adopt as possible for device makers in the IoT world, and ultimately for the consumers who really don't have any concept of security and how it should work. They just expect it to work.
And what's the cost for this to companies to include this?
It's less than $1. There are actually multiple different kinds of chips that can be used with different security levels, but less than $1 in some cases can be built into the main CPU, and then there's no extra cost at that point.
Okay, so excuse me, Matthew, you've been out there in the world. You've been an analyst for Intel, and one of the companies that's making these chips. Are you seeing the adoption of this in the electronics world?
Well, there's lots of different security capabilities. And, when we look at the stack where you've got, data and applications and operating system and virtualization, you get down to firmware, you get down to actual hardware. The hardware is that core root of trust. So there are tremendous benefits in embedding security at the hardware level. But there's also less flexibility too, because when you do that, you're kind of hard coding things in. You can make some minor changes here or there, but there's some drawbacks to being able to do that as well, because that means bad guys can do it. But having it embedded in the hardware, again, tremendously powerful. And these types of capabilities have actually been in chips and in systems for a very long period of time. In fact, the Trusted Computing Group has done developments here for several decades worth, and we see many of these solutions out there. Now, it's not a magic wand. There's no silver bullet. So some operating systems use it for certain aspects. Some applications sometimes have the access to use these things and are coded that way, and other times they're not. And even if an application and a piece of hardware and everything is using it, it doesn't actually guarantee perfect security, right? When we look at cybersecurity, we have to look at the technology, we have to look at the people, and we have to look at the process that connects them. If you have weakness in any of those, guess what? It doesn't matter how hard your hardware is. If you've got a bad user doing bad things or less than intelligent things, it can undermine the system's security, even though the system may be operating exactly as you would want it to. So there's many more nuances here when we're trying to communicate with end users and companies and saying, hey, you really need to be secure. And one of their first questions is, well, how much is it going to cost? How do I do this? And you start seeing the frustration bubble up, right? It's almost like you're speaking a foreign language. So, working with the end users, whether it's a small business owner or a Fortune 100 corporation, understanding what that risk appetite is, what their goals are, tying the benefits of security to their objectives of whatever service or product that they provide, their corporate objectives, is really part of that first step. Then you're building that, okay, let's figure out how valuable is security to me and what are the risks. Now we can start talking about whether it's expensive or not, right? Your airbag in your car is actually pretty expensive, but people are okay with it because it protects your life, right? So rationally, it isn't that expensive. I still want it. So the same thing about cybersecurity. We have to be able to rationalize and understand it. Whatever the features are, whether it's embedded in the hardware and the firmware operating systems, whether it's user behaviors, good policies, it's all woven together to be able to protect us against intelligent threats doing some, unfavorable things.
Yeah. And that brings us right to the core of this discussion about the issue of budgeting. Now, I looked up, Gartner was estimating that worldwide security spending grew 10.5% in 2019 compared to 0.4% growth in IT spending, which is really encouraging. Somebody's finally getting it. And the Enterprise Strategy Group also found that a majority of organizations plan to increase their spending in 2020. Hooray! Yay! But the problem is that the amount that's being spent is already pretty minuscule. As a rule of thumb, according to Frank Dixon, who's a program vice president of cybersecurity products at IDC, He said that an organization should spend between 7 and 10% of its IT budget on security. And then he said, however, you can spend 15% of your budget on security and still not achieve the level of protection that is especially valuable. So likewise, a 5% spend may be enough. So it all depends on what your situation is. But the question is, are we actually seeing an increase in the financial support of security in our technology? Either of you.
So I'll take a shot at that one. First off, it's really dangerous to put a percentage. Hey, and it used to be spend 10% of your IT budget or 20%, and people were throwing out numbers, and really it's unrealistic, because you're right, it all depends. It depends on what your goals are. It depends on what threats you're facing and what it's going to cost to get you to that optimal level of where you want to be. We never eliminate all risks, right? Every day is the risk, but it's finding what you're comfortable with when you're balancing the cost, the risk you're willing to accept, and then that friction that it's always going to create. So your security always creates a little bit of friction somewhere, either with the user or having to manage it, something like that. But those three things give trade-offs. And when you have that goal, that's what you need to go after. And if it's spending 3% of your budget, achieve your goal. If it means you have to spend 15% of your budget, but that, again, cost is part of it, and you're good with that, well, then that's what you should be spending. It's about end results, and the end result you're seeking is hitting that optimal level of risk management. So the percentage numbers, it's great for a soundbite, but in the real world, you have to take into account a lot more factors. And that first is defining what that goal is. What is your risk appetite? What are you trying to achieve? And then you start talking about, right, what it's going to cost and impact, and whether that's acceptable when you start fine tuning it.
Okay, Steve, you want to jump in there?
Absolutely. I completely agree with what Matt's saying there, that it is all about risk management. And I'd use a simple example to illustrate that. Think about your front door and how much you have spent to secure your front door. Now, consider if you were a business, you might be willing, perhaps if you were in a dangerous neighborhood, to spend more to secure your front door. You might have one of those roll down metal, fronts on your storefront. If it was an especially dangerous area and you thought people might break into your liquor store while you were closed, you would spend more on securing your front door because the risk is greater. And so the amount that you have to spend on security is greater. Think again. Think if you're a bank in an environment like that, how much do you have to spend then on securing your front door? Now you've ratcheted it up another level. Well, think if you're a military installation or something like, the level of risk and the amount that you're willing to spend on security, the amount you're willing to spend and you need to spend goes up as the level of risk goes up, or as your level of risk tolerance goes down. It's all about bridging that gap between the actual risk. If you were not protected, how much is that going to cost you, versus how low do I need to get it in order for me to be comfortable with it? So it really depends. I couldn't agree more. There is no one-size-fits-all answer to that. If you go and ask, some government security agency, what percentage of their budget are they spending on security? I can tell you it's a lot more than 10% of their budget. And that's probably true for diplomatic, institutions, for banks, and for perhaps for chemical plants, as well as for liquor stores in dangerous neighborhoods.
And now I'm going to take the devil's advocacy role here, because we can all know that cyber breaches have increased dramatically in the past year, simply because of so many people working from home. They're using their own servers, their own routers, their own technology that doesn't have the protections that are actually needed. And I did a little research into this and found that Microsoft, in its budget for new product development, is spending 0.4% of its development money on developing secure, cyber secure technology. And that's the stuff they're selling. That goes out to the general public. You know, we've talked really nicely about how corporations are taking care of themselves, and how we're building better security, and we're even seeing security ratchet up. But for the general public, especially those people that are living out in Iowa now because they couldn't afford to continue living in California, but they're still working for places like Facebook, what are we going to do for those people who are having to deal with their own security breaches that could effectively breach their own corporations?
Well, so there is an increase in the threat landscape when people are moving out of those secured offices and you've got other security controls there, both technical and behavioral. So when you're, for example, when you're in your cubicle or you're in your office, there is an air, especially if you've built a security culture there, to act appropriately. You shouldn't be surfing certain things. You shouldn't be clicking on certain things. You certainly wouldn't bring in a USB drive and plug it into your work laptop or something like that. When you move people home, again, we get this false sense of security, and we might do things that we wouldn't normally do. We might let the kids play on the TV or on our laptop. We might click on some things. There's nobody around. We might grab that USB that the wife hands you and plug it in. Oh, you wanted to see the neighbor's pics. Okay, sure. And so there's behavioral, there's technical issues. Many companies already had a lot of capability of remote connectivity, whether it's through VPN or something else. So, you know, we have to kind of peel back the onion to understand a little bit. Now, there are very, very effective means of mitigating some of those risks, especially the behavioral ones that can be low cost. The technical ones, what we saw early on when everybody was pushed remote, is those companies that didn't have that remote capability, they were scrambling. I was having conversations with major telecoms and major VPN vendors, and they were like, we're out of hardware equipment. The customers are demanding it, and we just don't have the equipment to sell them. We wish we did.
And it's even more so for people.
Yeah, major ISPs are saying we need to find software versions of this versus hardware, and you know, that's why they were talking with me and so forth. So again, we just kind of need to.
I wanted to interrupt here at this point because, yeah, that's true. But then we're also talking about the people who are educating their children remotely.
Yes, they are.
And the school, because my wife right now is over at my daughter's house because she is a master teacher and she's helping tutor both of my grandchildren. And my daughter's husband, he works for Google. He knows his stuff. Okay, but even the stuff that they've received from the school district has been horribly insecure and really spotty. So what are these kind of people? What do these people do?
Well, you shouldn't be running that on your work PC. Is that something you would run while in the office? Probably
no,
not.
But they're running it through their network.
Agreed. And again, you know, the internet's a dirty, evil, tough place to be if you don't have protections. It really is. It's not meant to be secure. It was never designed to be secure. And so this is a normal day if you're talking about being on a hostile network. So yeah, there are some concerns, but there's also mitigations for that. You know, we've got normal, VPN's been around for how long? Right? We do have application layer controls. We've got network layer controls. We have system and hardware layer controls. We've got all sorts of different stuff and best practices. You know, believe it or not, people were on the road and traveling, even traveling to foreign countries that purposely would try and hack you. And so, you know, the problems aren't new. They're just expanded out. And unfortunately, they're also expanded out to a group of potentially employees that aren't used to this. So the behavioral controls and everything else might not be as strong. But these
Okay.
are radically different problems.
All right, Steve, I want to take this over to you, and I want to ask you the question, because this stuff is available to us. You know, that's one of the things that drives me nuts about most of this stuff. When people say, "Oh, I got hacked. Did you do this?" No. So here's the question I have for you, Steve. How do we take advantage of the technology that we already have?
Well, exactly, Lou. A lot of the technology that we need in order to secure our systems is something that we've already bought and paid for. We're not talking about having to spend extra money to get BitLocker included in, or drive encryption included in your Windows 10 PC. It's built in there. It's included in Windows 10. It's called BitLocker. You just need to turn it on. What about multi-factor authentication? Well, that's included in Windows 10 as well, at least in professional versions of it. Windows Hello, that's built in. Have you turned it on as an IT professional? Have you turned it on for your users? Maybe you've done it for a subset of the users, those who you expected to have traveling. Those frequent travelers, you might have said, okay, we're going to turn on BitLocker. We're going to encrypt your hard drive. We're going to turn on multi-factor authentication to make sure that it's actually you and not your kid accessing it, or the evil maid, the proverbial evil maid, attacking and trying to break into your machine. But have you turned it on for all those folks who are working from home? Probably not. So you may not need to spend more. You might just need to deploy some of those technologies like BitLocker, like Windows Hello, that are built into the laptops that you sent home with everybody. And you may need to do a little more user education. The level of user education that you were doing for your users when they were spending most or all of their time in the office is different from the level of education that they're going to need now that they're spending all their time at home. Because one of the things that you see in that hostile network environment is that it's more likely that they're going to be encountering DNS records that have been altered in transit. So what that means is they may get pop-up ads that are not authentic, that have been inserted into a stream that they did not expect in a manner that they did not expect. And certainly one of the things that we're seeing more and more of these days is social engineering, using those pop-up ads and using simple things like spear phishing or phishing in general, where people get false information, misinformation, whatever you want to call it, lurid emails, scary emails. Click on this quickly. There's an emergency. You've got to do it now. Install this patch, whatever it is. We need to make sure that we as information security professionals are getting to our users before the bad guys do to educate them about what spear phishing looks like and how to avoid it, and to educate them that although we're in an unusual situation and we're all working from home, it doesn't mean that we throw aside our usual techniques for verifying that some information, that a purported email or web page is authentic, that they shouldn't just be calling the cell number that comes to them in the email or clicking on the link that comes to them in the email. So a lot of these things don't need a lot more money. They just need more effort and more attention to use those techniques that we may not have been using before, that we need to use more broadly now that we're all in a high-risk environment.
Yeah, I
Matthew?
think Steve is spot on here. I mean, we've got so much technology and features that have already been built in. You know, you can use that. You've already paid for it, right? There's a whole bunch of security features in Windows and even in home routers and stuff like that. And unfortunately, a lot of people, even with their anti-malware, they've got several pieces of it turned off. Why? Why would you do that, right? You know, and the other thing that you've already paid for are the employees themselves. And so when you get down to that social engineering, using them, you have to. In fact, there's no reputable, good security program out there that doesn't train its users. Because again, one user who is either not so bright or not poorly trained or distracted can undermine all your technology control. So you have to be a part of it. And the other thing you have, it may have a little dust on it, but you've got your policy set. You should have a security policy. And now that people are dispersed and we know the phishing and the social engineering comes up, it's time to maybe dust that off and refresh. Don't wait for that annual 30-minute refresh class. Let's be proactive. We understand how the threats are adapting. They're seeing crises and going, hey, I'm going to send out this phishing email talking about COVID or your benefits, or, you know, HR is trying to get a hold of you. Right? And we know that works. We have to let our employees know, guess what? Expect this. Here are the tools and the knowledge. Be suspicious. We're going to work with you, you know, report it, all these kinds of things. They're your employees. There's no capital hardware you have to buy for that. That's training. That's good practice. And that's something that everybody needs to continuously promote, especially in times like this where the threat landscape has changed in some way.
Gentlemen, we could probably go on for another 2 or 3 hours about this, but I don't think our listeners have time for it. So I want to thank you for this. It's a lot of food for thought here, and we need to start being more diligent. Thank you for joining us. This has been Crucial Tech with Lou Covey, Matthew Rosenquist, and Steve Hanna. Looking forward to talking more about this in another time soon.